The Conduit, Part 2, Method. There can be great joy in the act of being lost within the composition of theory. That is what one tells themselves as the dawn breaks, as I did, when it did. Slumping soon after, as all active vitality had been wholly expended by the process, wakefulness soon again found the horrid wretch of a hominid who has adequate cause to labor following a period of inadequate rest. Despite the deteriorated state of awareness that this state evokes, routine events passed without issue, as a 30% deduction of a person's conscious continuity is not typically sufficient to entirely derail procedural efforts, as many a listless worker can attest. In the minute instances of attentional vacancy, when the mind was not continuously forced into action by the salaried demands, I set to work that day upon functionally formulating what was to be the plan of action in the business of improving the strength of the conduit. The conduit, of course, referred to my own organic tether of consciousness, the brain, and the plottings included efforts to the effect of ensuring exceptional delivery of blood flow, electrolytes, and nutrients to the structure, in preparation for the mental descent down the ley line of the subconsciousness which the intrusion had left me with. This was to be carried out by means of rather mundane, yet intensive physical training, in addition to premeditated and ritualistic consumption of the pre-vital substances in precise proportions to the expected demands of my specific form and its movements. The mere partition of this physical training was to engage in mental efforts whenever the body had been temporarily exhausted, efforts to gain agency within the interior realm by way of directed visualizations through the movement and manipulation of cognitively generated objects. Additionally, a degree of memory training was to be implemented, to the end that the process of recall could be sifted through with greater continuity and in hope of superior conscious control, a developed function which would ideally be able to be engaged at an intuitive speed, even while the conscious awareness was suspended in the state of sleep. However lofty, these were the cognitive objectives at the onset, composed between that sleepless night and the fractionated, tiresome day which followed. Akin to many plans which are most effortlessly stated in shorthand, the process in earnest required a substantial duration before any results became manifest. As principles of consistency were applied, the form began to modify, gaining a solidity to the structures which had at no points previously been present. In tandem, the machinations of the mind gained greater and greater focal acuity through the trials of repeated delvings, and also came to possess the equivalence to that solidity in form and function which the body had undertaken exceptional labor to attain. The procedure for a typical attempt at delving was constituted by first a session of intensive visualization upon the prospective target. During this time, typically spanning a number of minutes, the object of curiosity was to become manifest within the purview of the mind's eye to the greatest possible extent with the degree of mental resources presently available. Then those energies were to extend outward, focusing further upon all possible associations with the initial material, to the limit of how many of those pathways could be reasonably explored at the rate by which they appeared. Once this burst of extensive activity had simmered down, next was to trace down the line of connections upon what struck the consciousness as the strongest association, or the day's area of interest, in cases of repeated action upon the same material. From there, the associations were in turn explored and visualized in as close to totality as was again possible given the constraints of present cognitive prowess. Over time, this resulted in recall networks of increasing complexity, interconnectedness, and clarity, such that there was always more territory within territories, as if inspecting some fractal. In truth, It took an exceptional duration of this practice to grasp an adequate degree of mastery towards the end of making an attempt upon the primary objective at hand, to trace the source of the nightmare intrusions back to their origin point, be that folded within some subliminal internal realm or pathway beyond. A number of setbacks barred the way to routine progress, as even with consistent efforts, the consistency of one's own mind can only be controlled to a minor degree, and the level of coherence in the attempts at visualization varied significantly by my state of cognition upon the day. The cause is always the same, but manifold, as when the disgusting animal form finds itself in a state of chemical imbalance of whatever sort. The higher functions of cognition and directed attention are impaired proportionally to the extent, location, and nature of that imbalance, in contrast to the position of the organs that facilitate those functions, largely the central nervous system. At times, the irritations can be resolved simply, as when the creature must consume the liquid, or release latent tension from within the form by whatever means, but often the nature of corporeal horror often orchestrates grand symphonies of interwoven affliction, which far surpass in complexity the interoceptive systems designed to indicate the causes of dysfunction. Thus, the consciousness must attend to these matters by its own methods, a process of often great deliberation and experiment, only to find itself enraptured in yet another permutation further down the line. Such is the nature of occupying space, and the innate movement of the pieces determine that one will rarely be unperturbed for long, much to the chagrin of the would-be introspector. Nevertheless, there came to be an interval when the faculties had become sufficiently bolstered by arduous effort, to the extent that a proper attempt at the primary objective needed to be made, for fear of lapsing into the eternal nursery of the training process. The initial step of this progression was in ensuring an optimal ambience, as one must always consider the environment a factor in matters of mind and matter alike, cultivating items of situation to the greatest benefit of the undertaker when success is to be achieved. An internal delving process was not exempt from this, and, under cover of darkness, I moved to unshackle the window of the spacious bedchamber before re-securing the safety of obscurity by way of the curtains. A calm breeze carried in the chemical signals typical of this area of the world, signaling within myself the beginnings of a state of composed serenity which the procedure desired. Despite the procedural and wholly scientific conduct of the business, if an observer were admitted into proximity, they may likely have testified to bearing witness to the induction of an occultist ritual of yore. Powders, implements, and a traced symbol lay before me, organized precisely upon the ground table, where I knelt in preparation for the act at hand. The symbol possessed no esoteric meaning in and of itself, as its purpose was simply to serve as an extraneous memory trigger, jogging the mind to conjure up the mental and physiological states associated by its previous tracings, establishing continuity through the span of practiced delvings. This stage was critical in enacting the forces of the form in unison, as even through heightened ability in internal conscious control, there exist conjoined processes emergent from the subsystems of body and mind, which require additional input from beyond the barrier of selfhood to be put into play. The assembled substances assisted in similar function, in addition to facilitating expansion of the breadth of experience in the manner which one might expect suspicious powders to perform. It was simply necessary, given that moment-by-moment phenomena, by default, exceed in richness the organ of interpretation's ability to digest the oncoming deluge of informational nourishment. To augment processing by specific chemical means was to reconcile the innate lapse in design which dissimulated these functions for the purpose of reactivity, honed for an ancient and largely vestigial survival. It was by the impetus of recollection that the fated descent into the mind began, as with intense focus I compelled the latent content into purview of the awareness, those demoniac caricatures which the dreamer had so readily and unknowingly interacted with during the initial nocturnal sequence. With the focal point of recall directed upon the torpid forms, their outlines began to shift, first moving to amalgamate with their innocuous equivalents, then subsequently demonstrating further dynamism by the unveiling of additional layers of latent content, which had concealed themselves beneath the noxious carapace. Mentally reaching out towards this entryway contained the semantic association of tugging on some mysterious root discovered beneath the floorboards, and it was with a voltaic jolt that the awareness was first transfixed, then horribly extruded through a pathway of seemingly acausal associations to the information at hand. The awareness next found itself reconstituted within an ostensibly foreign space within the memory, deposited within the confines of some obscure grotto of the mind through the act of heedless introspection. To ascribe the area in visual terms, as the phenomena was interpreted by the internal sight, the mnemonic grotto presented itself in a manner akin to a grand subterranean hall, situated within the confines of a crevasse, which had ostensibly not yet been unearthed from above. Crystals of ice shone on the cave walls with a dull radiance, illuminated from the sparse light allocated by the thick barrier of frozen false ceiling above. The majority of the cavern of memory space remained hushed by darkness, with only the faint outlines of hung picture frames jutting out to meet the observer. Naturally, the observer took efforts to meet with the aforementioned images with a curiosity of great haste, and it was there that the odious significance of the display first dispatched itself with clarity. Within that sequestered trench, the information imparted a most portentous conjoinment, to the extent that the delver was entirely enraptured by the spectacle. Awareness constituted itself again, not precisely within that forgotten cavern of the mind in exactitude, but in turn, situated in what could be assumed to be one of the memories housed in that place. It was that of a dream of the past, experienced initially by a version of self far less jaded and far more invigorated on the whole, not yet to have been wrenched asunder, fragmented and distilled by the passage of years and events which had followed. It was a most intricate phantasm, interwoven and multifaceted, sparing no expense and duration from either subjectivity or extraneous temporality alike. While the setting was undeniably similar to the initial iteration of this reverie, there was a definitive characteristic of unsettlement and presence, felt as I sifted through the bygone imagery, reconjured and rearranged by the unconsciousness. The discomfort positioned itself precisely in where, by all accounts, one might expect to find solace in the act of recollection, in the act of juxtaposition between the present entity and experience of the past. Instead, there lingered a malignance in the patterning of familiar imagery, and the lofty perspective often granted to present tense was diminished, reduced to like that of a child, wandering halls which it does not yet understand. The baleful sensation continued to impose itself with impending climactic force as my awareness navigated the multitude corridors of the dream scene. Detecting exceptional import of the source exuding from a particular scene, I stopped to discern it in detail, when instead the phenomenon displaced any requirement for discernment or doubt. The mind saw it, or perhaps one should say instead that it did not see it, for there was beyond all doubt no possibility that such an entity could be potentially perceived in its rightful and wholly malevolent form. Just there, entwined with my precious repository of recollection, that demon infracted itself upon the scene, in a manner and position which in some implicit way communicated that had always possessed that space within my psychological realm, merely lying in wait for the cognitive development to rise and meet the threshold of capacity which had previously rendered it indiscernible, layered in its lair, akin to the initial caricatures, but infinitesimally more abhorrent in its aspect than they. While this subversion of the circuitry utterly floored my consciousness by its realization, the action was not yet complete. As focus directed itself upon the imagery, it once again gained depth, displaying a myriad of nearly indescribable configurations of monstrosity, similar in aspect yet entirely unique in each permutation of limb and torso, claw and cartilage, assimilating structures of biological form rooted in all kingdoms of life simultaneously. Combining mutated appendages of chitness, bipedal, and animalistic origin in turn, formulating in entirety a multitude of bestial effigies confederated to undermine the very verisimilitude of our world. Indeed, a mass composed of such a visceral, abominable, reprehensible, odious, detestable, and thoroughly abhorrent nature, which by all functions of nature could never be allowed to walk the face of the earth. Despite the lingering shock of this phantasmagoric burst, one could never have been prepared for the event which followed. Still patterned into reaction of those visages, I found the energies of primordial terror carried on in part into waking life, as now the trance-like state of delving had partially been dispersed, and the memorial reiteration of phantasm had now transformed into what was felt as hypnagogic, activity which occurs exclusively at the bounds of sleep and wakefulness, where sensations typically tucked far away from the privy of the waking mind can be revealed to the somnolent. Information, revelation itself, erupted like a geyser, thrust upon the semi-awakened consciousness with such force that all focus was captured, dragged away even from the self-monitoring function which never rests, to create an experience entirely subjected without tangential interior commentary. In lieu of the monologue, a surge of what seemed ancestral whispers flooded in, and it became so abundantly clear in that moment that these entities could not be understood to be literal, given the anatomical impossibility of having ever taken terrestrial shape, but were instead manifest within the mind, akin to any other stimuli, the earnest representation of which exists outside the referential capacity of the observer to perceive. Instead, as a striking example of the brain's ability of constructive perception, the item is displayed as some assembly by the mind of existing interior concepts of potentially similar aspect, however lackluster and inferior in notion to the extraneous original represented. The geyser of knowledge churned, extruding with rapidity the depths of the unconsciousness into the purview of awareness with the exceeding magnitude of torrential force and excitement, which a tide that has finally met its cosmic schedule to upwell might exude. The stream of forced ideation continued on, asserting its origin to indeed be ancestral, and with this, subsequently confirming the horrific implications of the mnemonic sabotage. There had been no extraneous intrusion of the mind, in the truest sense, only an influx upon the boundaries of the territory over which the conscious awareness claims sovereignty. The odious and interceding abstractions, which had seemingly interlaced themselves within my memories, had evidently always been present there, as they represented a form of information processing antiquated to the conscious awareness, yet entirely still in circulation within the network of cognitive machinations situated lower on the hierarchy of command. Only the most lax student of the science of mind could fail to name the theory behind the lurking, fundamental tear displaced by our origins. Departing from that point in time, the encoded concepts being concurrently imparted, accelerated in complexity, depth, and aggression, to such a maddening and frantic extent that the presently conscious partition of the brain detected visually that the bodily form pertaining to it seemed to be engaging in convulsions, ostensibly a physiological effect brought on by the exceptional rate and potency of the ancients' galvanic transmission.